Guys, I'm really happy to welcome to the podcast Nancy Armstrong. She's an Emmy-nominated producer, and she has a new film that Debbie and I just watched. It's called The Disruptors. It's about the phenomenon called ADHD. Most of us are familiar with someone that has ADD or ADHD. And this is a film that, by the way, is up on my Locals channel. You can check it out at Disruptors. That's disruptors.locals.com. And Nancy, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We have a family member, actually my stepson, who has ADHD. But I have to say, it's not something I knew that much about. We think of it as a kind of a deficiency, I guess, of some sort. This was a really eye-opening film for me because I sort of understood ADHD as, you could almost call it an alternative neurological wiring that gives people, that may be an impediment in some ways, but can be also a great strength in other ways. So let's begin by asking, how did you get interested in this topic and decide to make a film about it?
Yeah, well, I raised 3 children with ADHD, and it was much more challenging than I ever thought parenting was going to be. And it was so frustrating to me that there was no film on ADHD. There's films on everything under the sun, but there was no definitive comprehensive film on ADHD. And I thought it would have been so helpful to have that, not only for our own understanding, but also for the community in which our children were growing up in. Teachers, coaches, bus drivers, for them all to understand that these kids are wired a little bit differently and that they just need a little more support in their world.
I mean, it's so eye-opening because Debbie will chuckle at this, but I have an uncle in India that I'm now convinced has ADHD. And for years, we just thought of him as unbelievably eccentric because he would come over to parties. He would refer to very obscure items that he had spotted in the newspaper that he had developed a kind of laser-like focus on. He wouldn't stop talking about it. And so, my brothers and my sister and I were just like, man, this guy is like nuts. We didn't understand that he just saw the world differently. So watching a film like this just opens your eyes to the fact that these people aren't really dysfunctional. They, in fact, can learn to be extremely functional. And talk about some of the people who are in the film who argue that well-managed ADHD can be a strength.
Well, it's really been around forever, since the beginning of man. We've been talking about ADHD in the history books since the 1700s. It's just evolved in our understanding and what we've called it. But like you said about your uncle, that we didn't do a very good job diagnosing, years ago. My mother sounded very similar to your uncle. She had all of those struggles and we didn't understand quite what was going on with her, but it turns out she had a pretty heavy dose of ADHD. And what we've come to understand in the last 20 or 30 years is that this is very common. It's the most common diagnosis in children, and it's about 9.4% of the children population in this country, and it's global. So we've come to understand it, and we've also seen that through history, some of our greatest innovators, creators, inventors, they all had the symptoms of ADHD. And so we tried to highlight that both sides of this. For so long, we only focused on the deficit, and we didn't focus on, the asset of ADHD. If you can manage the challenges, you can turn this into a great skill.
I mean, you've got all these fascinating people, from the great quarterback Terry Bradshaw. You've got entrepreneurs. I thought it was fascinating when Glenn Beck, who's in the documentary, talks about when he comes on set, he says, there's 50 things going on. And normally it's impossible for someone to kind of digest the kind of overall scene and recognize this needs to be fixed, move that light over there. But his ADHD comes into play and it rapid fires inside his brain, and he's able to kind of do something that I guess is remarkable for someone who's managing this kind of media operation. So I thought it was eye-opening how ADHD can be converted into a source of creativity, innovation, and it leads to some of our most distinguished people in America today.
Well, it's the flip side of what is the impediment. So, as Ned Hallowell, one of the foremost experts in the world on ADHD, who's also in the film, is each of the three core symptoms, the triad of symptoms, impulsivity, distractibility, and hyperactivity. Those can be an impediment if you don't manage them. But the flip side are very positive. And in Glenn's case, he is all of those things. He's, impulsive, he's hyperactive, he's got all that energy, and he's got what every person with ADHD has, which is lower dopamine. So when Glenn gets into a really stimulating environment, like that studio where there's a million things going on at once, his dopamine starts to fly at a really comfortable level. So that's why he's so good in that environment. ER doctors, engineers, things that are high stimulation or high creativity. Those are great fields for people with ADHD because their brain turns on in those situations.
I posted the film over the weekend on my locals channel, and I'm just kind of scrolling through the comments, and people seem to really love the film. And there's a whole bunch of people who have ADHD, or they have a son or daughter with it, and they testify to the exquisite balance of the film, the fact that it doesn't attempt to sugarcoat anything. Sometimes in our day, people will take deficiencies and pretend like they're great virtues. I'm 400 pounds, but it's a wonderful thing for my health. But this film doesn't do that. There was one thread of criticism, though, I wanted to mention to you, and there are some people who are taking the film. I didn't take it this way, and neither did Debbie, as sort of an apologetic for Big Pharma. They're like, well, this film advocates Big Pharma. I didn't see it that way at all. But would you address that point?
Sure. Yeah. I think the film is pretty agnostic about medication in general. There's been a lot of misinformation about medication and the fact that some people who don't have ADHD abuse Adderall. That's, there's a big Adderall shortage right now in the country. And I think part of the problem is that, well, there's the supply chain issue, but there's also that people are just throwing these prescriptions around, pediatricians who are not really trained to deal with those medications. And we saw even in the film that, that very point of when the pediatrician had Brianna cut her medication in half, a time-release medication. You can't cut time-release medication in half. So that was kind of unbelievable. But really, the film tries to say that it's a very personal decision to take medication, but it's one tool in a toolbox that you have to really employ many different strategies to help kids with ADHD because it is a struggle growing up. There's no way around that. It's hard. It's been hard for our family. And that's why I wanted people to be able to see their children in this film. I wanted parents to see themselves in the film because there's a lot of parental guilt around the fact that we don't do it right. We're getting it wrong. And this is not a film about Big Pharma. There is research around the medication, and it's important to know what the research is. And the research is that it can be very effective in 80% of the cases where you want to get target symptom relief with no side effects. But medication's not for everyone.
Guys, it's a really good film. It just begins in the perfect way with a parent-child interaction and the kind of breakdown of communication that occurs where ADHD is creating a kind of mental wall between the child and the parent. This is something that the film treats with, I think, with great compassion and insight. It's a fun film to watch. It's called The Disruptors, and if you want to watch it, go to Disruptors. That's disruptors.locals.com. You'll have a choice, by the way. You can just buy it, stream it, and watch it, or you can subscribe to my locals channel, and the film will be just included with your annual subscription. Nancy Armstrong, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Dinesh.